This is our third installment of the book, Every Square Inch, by Bruce Riley Ashford. We're going to look at two chapters today. In chapter 4, he studies 6 case studies on culture. Now, he states that his purpose for this chapter is to show examples of men and women who sought to direct their cultural activity toward Christ. He examines 6 people. He goes to Augustine from the early church, Balthasar Hubmaier, maybe an unknown figure to you. He comes from the Reformation. Abraham Kuiper from the late 1800s. We'll talk a little bit more about him. Dorothy Sayers from the early 1900s, and we'll talk a little bit more about her. Then C.S. Lewis from the mid-20th century, and Francis Schaeffer from the 60s and 70s in the 20th century. Abraham Kuiper is somebody that I'd heard of, but I knew very little about. Let me just quote from Ashford. Abraham Kuiper lived in the Netherlands in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. He was a pastor, a journalist, a newspaper founder, a professor, a university founder, a parliament member, and eventually a prime minister. From these many vantage points, Kuiper sought to work out the implications of the gospel. Both his writings and his life story show us a Christian who not only critiqued culture, but made culture. Now, Ashford comes back to that term quite a bit, making culture. He uses it again when he talks about Dorothy Sayers. That's another figure that I was kind of aware of, but I knew very little about. She lived at the very end of the 19th century, so the late 1800s. She died in the 20th century. She was a poet, she was an author, and she was a playwright. She was one of the first women to receive a degree from Oxford. Before her, and in fact this happened to her, she graduated from Oxford, but they never gave women degrees. A couple of years after she graduated, she had become so famous that they came back and they gave her a degree to go along with her graduation. Now, she is best known for writing kind of a new genre, crime fiction. Arthur Conan Doyle writing about Sherlock Holmes. Well, Dorothy Sayers created a fictional sleuth, Lord Peter Wimsey. Sayers came to the Lord after she had created Lord Peter Wimsey. Peter Wimsey, like herself, was a religious skeptic. He was an agnostic. But Sayers came to the Lord. She underwent a full conversion. She decided, however, that it would break character for her to have Wimsey also go through the same conversion. So she kept her fictional character, a religious skeptic, and instead wove themes into Christian themes into her knowledge, into her novels. She engaged culture through her books and through her plays. She believed that God reveals aspects of himself through the created order. Let me quote Ashford here. She also recognized the impact of sin on the world as it disrupts the created order, disorders our lives, and distorts our interpretation of God's creational revelation. Now, Sayers looked at culture, and she said it's an error to withdraw from culture, but it's also an error to simply become one with culture. She concluded that the church must do the impossible. It must influence culture without becoming identified with the institutions of culture. Now, for Ashford, each of his examples shows how to live faithfully in their own time and place and engage culture. They even make culture, to use Ashford's term, through public forums. Each was faithful to their understanding of Scripture, and they spoke from an openly Christian position, although not necessarily from a Christian platform. They were not speaking in church. They spoke to the world. Now, the following chapter, he talks about art. When he talks about art, what he's doing is he's trying to show how a Christian worldview can affect our perception of the arts. Now, I really enjoyed this chapter. I like art. I've never really understood it or been able to express what I felt about art. Well, Ashford kind of helped me gain a handle on that. He starts with the biblical storyline. Here I'm quoting largely from what he writes. In the creation account, God is portrayed as the first artist and craftsman. The world we live in, and we ourselves, are the product of his craftsmanship and artistry. Additionally, in those chapters, we learn that he created human beings in his image and his likeness. That implies that we'll be artful and creative, similar to the way God is artful and creative. Good art, says Ashford, is art that honors God and causes human beings to flourish. But after the fall, every dimension of culture, including the arts, has experienced the corrupting and misdirecting influence of sin. Bad art is art that's warped and distorted by sin and idolatry, which arises from a wrong view of God and his good world. Now, in the midst of this fallen state of affairs, the Son of God came to earth and took on human flesh. He is the exact representation of God. And he quotes Hebrews 1:3. He is the image of the invisible God. And he quotes Colossians 1:15. Ashford goes on, he says, all art and indeed all culture are measured by the standard of the incarnate Son. Additionally, because of the incarnate Son's redemption, we now seek to bring healing and redirection to the arts by producing art that honors Christ and is free from the corrupting influence of sin. Now, Ashford goes on, and this is the part that I really enjoyed. He uses a book by Francis Schaeffer called Art and the Bible, and he lays out a technique for understanding art. Schaeffer talks about 4 elements. First of all, the technical excellence of the artifact. Whether it's a painting, a song, a film, a statue, whatever the artist has created, does the artifact show skill in execution? The second element is validity. Is the artifact in alignment with the artist's worldview? The third area is content. And here, this brings the particularly Christian approach. Is the artist's worldview resonant with the Christian worldview? And then finally, Schaeffer suggests that we look at the integration of content and vehicle. Does the artifact match content, whether or not the artist's worldview resonates with the Christian worldview, and style, the technical excellence of the artifact? Okay, that's a little bit theoretical. So let's get real practical. I want to pull up a painting that I actually had the opportunity to see once upon a time. We were in Las Angeles, we went to the Museum of Art in Los Angeles, and they had this picture by Vincent Van Gogh there. The picture he titled, "Vase with Irises Against a Yellow Background." Now, it was painted in 1890. That's the year that Van Gogh died. But it was painted while he was still in a psychiatric hospital in St. Remy. Now, you'll see here in the picture some beautiful blue irises. Originally, the flowers were purple, but Van Gogh he mixed red and blue oils together, and the red pigment faded, the blue didn't. So we're left with blue irises. Let's go through those four elements. Technical excellence. In this painting, I love the natural beauty of the flowers. I also like the somewhat unreal look of the vase. It doesn't look like a real vase, does it? It's like Van Gogh is seeing the flowers as still living, even though they've been cut and moved into his studio. He looks at them as though they're still planted, still alive. Second point, validity. Van Gogh sent this painting to his mother, or at least his mother acquired it. He had written his mother. He said, "During my time here in St. Remy in the psychiatric ward, for one's health, it was necessary to work outdoors in a garden and see the flowers growing." Now, Van Gogh talks in essence about the healing power of nature, of the beauty of nature. And that kind of comes across in this painting. Let's look at the third element, content. Now, this is really subjective. Van Gogh commits suicide just 2 months later. He was in a wheat field, he was painting, and apparently he shot himself with a 7mm gun. The bullet, however, didn't hit any major organs. It kind of weaved its way around the major organs, but it couldn't be extracted. It had lodged against his spine. He died 30 hours later of the infection that the bullet caused. According to his brother Theo, his last words were, "The sadness will last forever." But you know, when I look at the painting of these flowers, I see nothing of that sadness. It seems like Van Gogh's mind is divided. He lives in sadness, but he finds solace and health in God's creation, in nature. The fourth element, the integration of content and vehicle. Now, if Van Gogh is painting about the healing power of the irises, I think that really comes through. The painting is peaceful, although the original variation of yellow background and deep purple flowers would have made a bold statement about the existence of contrasts in nature. Maybe the existence of contrasts between Van Gogh's own mind and the beauty and solace of nature. When we come back next week, we'll look at the next 2 chapters in Every Square Inch.